The most useful room in American history wasn't a kitchen. It was a rag bag, a button jar, a grease can by the stove. Grandma ran a household on things we throw away before breakfast. 41 of them, gone so completely most people don't even know they existed. 1. The grease can. There was a tin can on the back of Grandma's stove that most people today would throw in the trash without thinking twice. A can full of bacon grease. In 1942, the Roosevelt administration formed the American Fat Salvage Committee. Their mission? Get American housewives to save every drop of cooking fat and donate it to the war effort. Fat rendered into glycerin. Glycerin made explosives. Disney was brought in. Minnie Mouse stood at a stove in a government cartoon holding a can of drippings, telling American women their kitchen grease was needed on the front lines. In 1 week in July 1942, housewives in a single county turned in 802 pounds of saved grease, enough glycerin to fire over 400 rounds of anti-tank ammunition. But here's the part that stops people cold. 3/4 of American households were already saving their bacon grease before the government campaign started, not for the war, because that fat seasoned beans, fried potatoes, enriched cornbread, and kept a cast-iron skillet from going dry. The government didn't teach Grandma to save the grease can. She already knew. They just finally found another use for what she'd been doing all along. Today, we pour it down the drain. 2. The seed envelope. Somewhere in a kitchen drawer, tucked into a worn seed catalog studied every February, was a paper envelope the size of a playing card. Inside it, next year's garden. The story that captures what seed saving meant belongs to a man named Marshall Cletus Biles. People called him Radiator Charlie. He ran an auto repair shop at the bottom of a mountain in West Virginia during the Depression. Business was slow, so Radiator Charlie spent 6 years cross-pollinating tomatoes until he bred a plant that produced the biggest, most reliable tomato anyone had ever seen. He sold the seedlings for $1 each. Farmers drove hundreds of miles. He paid off his entire $6,000 mortgage from those sales. He named it the Mortgage Lifter Tomato. You can still buy those seeds today because people kept saving them, envelope after envelope, generation after generation. A seed envelope wasn't just next year's garden, it was next year's possibility, held in a piece of folded paper. 3. The feed sack dish towel. In 1925, a flour company introduced Gingham Girl flour, packaged in fine red and white checked fabric, not because the flour was better, because the sack was. By the Depression, the feed sack had become one of the most resourceful materials in American domestic life. Dish towels, pillowcases, aprons, curtains, children's dresses. Companies hired European designers to create stylish, color-fast prints. Farm wives sent husbands to the store with specific instructions: get 3 sacks of the same pattern because a dress required 3 bags worth of fabric. But there was a shadow side. For many women, a feed sack dress was a mark of poverty. They soaked the sacks in hot water to remove company logos. They dyed the fabric, added ribbons and embroidery, anything to make it look store-bought. Then the Depression changed the calculus. Making do became thrift. Thrift became patriotic. And in 1951, years after the Depression ended, years after the war was won, Marilyn Monroe posed wearing a burlap potato sack. The feed sack dish towel started all of that. It was just trying to dry some plates. 4. The mending basket. In the corner of almost every American home before 1960, there was a basket. Needles, spools, thread, patches, spare buttons, a darning egg. The mending basket represented something that has almost entirely disappeared: the idea that a broken thing deserves your attention before it deserves the trash. A sock with a hole was not finished. A shirt missing 1 button was not ruined. A child's coat with a torn elbow might still have another winter in it. Here is the fact that stops most people cold. During World War II, darning salons opened in major American cities, not sewing shops, establishments where you brought a worn garment to be expertly repaired. It was fashionable. Repairing your clothes was chic. Magazines covered it. By the late 1970s, that had completely reversed. Mending became associated with poverty. The skill faded from schools, from households, from memory. The mending basket didn't just hold thread and needles, it held a philosophy about what things are worth. Somewhere between the post-war boom and the discount store, we decided broken things weren't worth that much.
5. The home canning shelf. In 1858, a 26-year-old tinsmith from Philadelphia named John Landis Mason patented a threaded glass jar with a screw-on metal lid that created an airtight seal. Before this, home preservation was a mess of wax seals and guesswork. Mason's jar made home canning reliable for the first time. His invention spread across the country. During both World Wars and the Great Depression, the Mason jar stood at the center of American domestic survival. Then his patent expired in 1879. Every competitor immediately copied his design. Ball, Kerr, Atlas, they built empires on what Mason invented. They made fortunes. His name became permanently attached to the jar in the American vocabulary. John Landis Mason died in 1902 in a tenement house in New York City, in poverty. The man whose invention helped feed America for half a century never saw a dollar from it after his patent ran out. The canning shelf in Grandma's pantry was a monument to what he built. She probably never knew his name. 6. The scrap quilt. Here is something almost no one knows about Depression-era quilts. The scrappy look, all those tiny pieces of different fabric sewn together, was not primarily a sign of poverty. It was a trend. The colonial revival movement had sparked a national interest in American folk arts. The patchy, cheerful look of a scrap quilt was fashionable. Women's magazines promoted it. Here is the proof. In 1932, at the height of the Depression, Sears sold boxes of pre-cut cotton scraps specifically for making scrap quilts. The Frederick Hirschner Company sold a complete double wedding ring kit with die-cut pieces ready to stitch for $3.95. If scrappy quilts were purely about poverty, nobody would have been buying them pre-packaged. The more pieces in a quilt, the more fabric a woman had access to. A quilt with hundreds of tiny pieces didn't say we had nothing. It said we had enough to give some away. The quilt on Grandma's bed wasn't just warmth, it was a statement. And the statement wasn't the one most people assume. The rag bag. On a hook behind a closet door hung a bag. Coarse, practical, not decorative. The last address for cloth that had used up every other life available to it. Old shirts too thin for wearing, split sheets, flour sacks past their softness, rough towels, organized by judgment, not labels. A clean, soft square could still wipe a child's face. A rougher piece cleaned stove soot. A really rough piece got the porch or the barn. Nothing went directly from torn to trash. It went to the rag bag first, where it waited for someone to ask the question that organized almost everything in an older American household. Is there still life left in this? Today, a spill means tearing off a paper towel and throwing it away immediately. A whole industry exists to sell you the privilege of discarding something the moment after you use it. Grandma had a bag in the closet that made that industry unnecessary. She didn't call it sustainability, she called it taking care of what you had. 8. The darning egg. A smooth, egg-shaped piece of wood on a short handle. If you're under 50, there's a good chance you've never seen one. It was inserted into the toe or heel of a worn sock to hold it taut while you wove new thread across the hole, rebuilding the fabric from scratch, using undamaged cloth as your anchor. Done well, the repair was nearly invisible. Done beautifully, and some women became genuinely skilled at this, invisible entirely. When formal darning eggs weren't at hand, women used burnt-out incandescent light bulbs, almost exactly the right shape and smoothness. Many families in the 1940s kept a burnt-out bulb in the mending basket specifically for this purpose. The darning egg disappeared when socks became cheap enough to replace, but the skill it represented, looking at a damaged thing and rebuilding it from within, rather than discarding and replacing, that skill is simply gone now. Most people today wouldn't know where to start. The flour sack children's dress. A photograph from the 1930s, a young girl in a cheerful printed cotton dress in front of a farmhouse. It used to be a bag of chicken feed. For many families, clothing from feed sacks was a mark of poverty. Women soaked the sacks for hours to remove company logos, over-dyed the fabric, added lace and buttons, anything to look store-bought. Children wore these dresses to school, knowing sometimes that other children knew. Then something shifted. Feed companies hired textile designers from New York and Europe, competing on pattern quality and color-fast dyes. A farm wife whose husband came home with mismatched prints heard about it. The stigma faded, making a dress from a feed sack stopped being failure and became what a practical woman did because the fabric was good. The girl in that photograph carries the full weight of that history. She probably didn't know the half of it. 10. The soap scrap jar. Near the wash basin, a jar holding the last thin slivers of soap worn past the point of comfortable use, but with cleaning still left in them. In many households, these were pressed together while soft into a new bar, misshapen, entirely functional. In others, softened into soap jelly for floors and pots. The deeper history runs further back. Soap making was the annual spring event on American farms through most of the 18th and 19th centuries. Months of saving ash and fat all winter, then one long day over an outdoor kettle making the year's supply. Commercial soap only became universal after World War I. The jar of scraps by the sink persisted long after, because waste was waste, and the last sliver still had soap in it. 11. The clothesline. A young man named James Moore lived on a North Dakota farm in the early 20th century. One winter day, he watched his mother struggle to hang wet laundry on an outdoor line in temperatures that froze the clothes stiff before she could pin the second end. He later said, "I could not bear to see my mother have to endure this." He spent the next 30 years developing a solution. He finally built a drum-type electric model that worked, patented it in 1936, and struck a deal with the Hamilton Manufacturing Company. They named it the June Day Dryer. It went on sale in 1938. Most families couldn't afford one for years. The clothesline remained the standard through the 1950s. But Moore's 30-year obsession, sparked by one winter morning watching his mother's hands freeze on a line in North Dakota, is the direct reason the clothesline is now an oddity rather than a fixture. 12. The braided rag rug. On the kitchen floor or at the bedroom door, a rug that looked like nothing you could buy in a store. Thick and tight, striped in colors that didn't match anything currently in the house, because they weren't from anything currently in the house. They were from what the house used to wear. A child's faded dress, a father's retired work shirt, kitchen curtains bleached pale by years of morning sun. What most people don't know, braided rugs is a uniquely American art form. Using braided fabric strips to make rugs developed specifically in North America, almost certainly in New England in the early 19th century, after the American textile industry made affordable fabric available for the first time. Before that, fabric was too precious to cut up for floors.
American county fairs in the 1800s gave prizes for braided rugs alongside patchwork quilts. Britain dismissed rag rugs as working-class objects. America gave them ribbons. 13. The herb bundle. From kitchen ceiling beams, from attic hooks, bunches of dried plants hung in American homes for most of this country's history. Mint, chamomile, elderberry, comfrey, calendula, sage. Before the supplement aisle, before the chain pharmacy, before NyQuil, the herb bundle was the pharmacy. For the vast ordinary run of household illness, a child's fever, a winter cough, cracked skin from outdoor work, the herbs on the beam had been managing these things for generations before any drugstore existed. This knowledge was passed from grandmother to daughter in kitchens and gardens, demonstrated, practiced, corrected, refined. It didn't come from a book. It came from watching someone who knew. Most of it is gone now, not because it didn't work, because the chain pharmacy was easier, and easier over time replaces almost everything. 14. The button jar. A jelly jar full of buttons, white shirt buttons, dark coat buttons without mates, brass buttons from a military uniform, pearl buttons from a wedding dress that became a rag dress, that became strips for the quilt. To a modern eye, clutter. To a grandmother, inventory. Buttons came off worn garments before those garments became rags. You didn't throw away a button, you harvested it. When a shirt lost a button, you went to the jar, sorted by feel, found something close enough, threaded a needle, 5 minutes, fixed. Disposable culture trains you to see failure as final. Older household culture treated failure as a request for attention, a small problem with a small solution if you'd had the foresight to keep the solution in a jar on a shelf.
15. The beeswax furniture polish tin. Before Pledge arrived in an aerosol can in 1958, furniture was maintained with a tin made by hand. 3 ingredients: beeswax, boiled linseed oil, turpentine, applied by hand, buffed with a cotton cloth. This wasn't fast, but it did something the aerosol can doesn't do. It fed the wood. Wood is a living material even after it's been shaped into furniture. It drinks oil. Furniture regularly fed with oil and wax develops a depth of finish over decades that no spray product can replicate. The furniture in Grandma's parlor that looked so much richer than anything you can buy today, the table that still stands in someone's family, dark and smooth, it looked that way because someone had been feeding it since before you were born. The spray can is faster, but it leaves a film, and the film hides the neglect until the day it doesn't. 16. The root cellar system. Under the house, or dug into a north-facing hillside, the root cellar was the refrigerator before refrigerators existed, and something a refrigerator has never been, a complete system for keeping a family alive from harvest to spring. Potatoes in boxes of dry sand, apples wrapped individually in newspaper, one rotting apple touching its neighbors spread quickly. Cabbages hung by their roots from ceiling hooks, winter squash on shelves, never touching. The whole system was a household's bet against winter, a calculation made in August about how much of everything would be needed between October and April. The refrigerator solved cold storage. What it didn't replace was the annual discipline of counting honestly what you had and asking whether it would be enough. 17. The boot repair kit. Leather scraps, cobbler's tacks, an owl, polish, replacement laces, a last for holding the boot steady while you worked. Before cheap shoes, footwear was expensive relative to household income. Every town had a cobbler. A torn boot had real consequences. Wet feet meant missed work, a child walking to school in pain.
Care started before damage arrived. Mud was brushed off before it dried. Laces replaced before they frayed through. Soles watched for thinning where wear always came first. The cobbler's shop disappeared from most American towns in the 1970s and 80s as imported shoes became cheap enough that replacement cost less than repair. The boot repair kit understood something we've largely abandoned. Things cared for outlast things merely owned. 18. The handmade rag doll. Feed sack cotton, button eyes, yarn hair, a face embroidered with careful stitches. For many Depression-era children, the rag doll was the only toy, meant to be dragged through every room, clutched through nightmares, mended and remended until the repairs outnumbered the original stitches. In the Depression, an Indiana woman named Portia Sperry made rag dolls and sold them through a small craft shop in Brown County. Her work spread by word of mouth. In 1938, she published a children's book based on one of her dolls, a character named Abigail. The original Abigail doll eventually found its way to the Smithsonian Institution, where it is part of the American Enterprise Collection, representing the ingenuity of ordinary American families during one of the hardest decades in the country's history. A rag doll made from a feed sack at the Smithsonian.
19. The laundry starch tin. Before permanent press fabric in the 1950s, clothing wrinkled badly. Cotton and linen lost their crispness in washing and required starch and hot iron to be presentable. Grandmothers made their own from boiled cornstarch, heavy starch for men's collars, medium for dress shirts, light for curtains. The iron worked with the starch. Without it, the iron just moved wrinkles around. Permanent press fabric, introduced using a chemical treatment in the late 1950s, eliminated the need almost overnight. By the mid-1960s, the laundry starch tin had faded to the back of the laundry aisle. Today, it sits in grocery stores, bought mostly by embroiderers who need stiff fabric. The women who used it every wash day are mostly gone now. 20. The bread box. A metal or wooden box with a roll-top lid, sized for a loaf. Before commercial bread arrived pre-sliced and preserved, every kitchen had one. A good bread box had ventilation built in, small gaps allowing just enough air circulation to prevent mold while keeping the cut surface from drying too quickly. It was a piece of engineering in the shape of a kitchen object. It disappeared for a specific reason. In 1930, Wonder Bread began selling pre-sliced bread. By mid-century, commercial bread was preserved well enough that the bread box was unnecessary. There was nothing wrong with the bread box. The problem it solved simply ceased to exist. Today, if you bake your own bread or buy from a real bakery, you need one again. The problem came back the moment the industrial solution stopped being used. 21. The homemade salve tin. A small metal tin of thick, pale ointment, lard or beeswax base with herbs worked in. Calendula for inflammation, comfrey for tissue repair, lavender for its antiseptic properties. Burns from the stove, cracked skin from outdoor work in cold weather, chapped lips, small cuts. The neosporin in the bathroom cabinet, the hydrocortisone cream, the petroleum jelly, the antifungal powder. All of these answer problems the salve tin was already solving, in a single container, made from things that grew in the garden. The salve tin didn't go away because it stopped working. It went away because what replaced it was easier to buy. 22. The saved jar. Every kitchen before 1950 had them: jelly jars, pickle jars, coffee bottles, with labels soaked off. Any glass container that arrived full and left empty went on a shelf, not in the trash. These jars held nails, buttons, dried beans, bacon grease, seeds, spare screws, dried herbs.
A pantry shelf full of saved jars was a visible map of household readiness. You didn't have to remember what you had, you could see it, behind glass. Modern storage is purchased as a product. Older households turned yesterday's container into tomorrow's order. The only cost was the habit of not throwing it away before asking whether it still had a use. The pantry rotation system. Oldest jar forward, newest jar back. Never let anything get pushed behind the molasses and forgotten. Without a system, a pantry became an archaeological site. Molasses from 2 years ago behind the current molasses, an unidentified jar in the back corner that had been waiting long enough that no one was sure what it was. Before refrigerators made year-round abundance the default, this system was how families actually used what they had put up, rather than letting it become the passive burden of a crowded shelf where things waited until they were no longer worth eating.
24. The tin of saved hardware. A tobacco tin or coffee can rattling with screws, nails, washers, odd brackets, a bolt whose nut had gone missing. Every time something was disassembled, a broken appliance, a hinge replaced, a handle refastened, the fasteners went into the tin rather than the trash, because the day would come when the right screw wasn't in the hardware store in town, or the store was closed, or the project needed finishing right now. Modern repair often stops entirely when one small part is missing. Grandpa's tin prevented most of that, not through foresight about any specific problem, just through the long habit of never throwing away a screw without first asking whether it might be needed. 25. The homemade apron. Not a costume, not a prop, not a gift item from a farmhouse-themed store. A working tool with pockets. It protected the dress underneath from flour, grease, water, berry juice, ash. It carried clothespins to the line, beans from the garden, the paring knife, a handful of kindling. It protected the dress, one of a small number a woman owned, because that dress was a real investment in a household that tracked what things cost. Homemade from whatever was available, the seams didn't need to be beautiful, they needed to hold. 26. The wax paper reuse. A used sheet of wax paper was smoothed flat, folded carefully, and put away for next time if it had stayed clean. This ended in 1953 when Saran wrap arrived. The product had been developed during World War II as a moisture barrier on fighter jets and ammunition clips. Dow Chemical found domestic applications after the war. It was cheap, clingy, and designed to be used once and thrown away. Within a decade, the habit of saving wax paper had faded. That's how most of these habits ended, not with a decision, with a product. 27. The draft stopper. A rolled towel, a sewn fabric tube filled with sand, a length of old blanket along the base of a door. In older houses, winter came under doors, through gaps around windows, through uninsulated walls. A draft stopper was a meaningful difference in how a kitchen felt on a January morning. It kept heat from sliding out into the yard. It made fuel last longer. Old household scents began where discomfort entered the room. A draft was noticed, located, addressed with whatever was at hand. This is not remarkable, but it is a way of paying attention to a home that has become genuinely uncommon. 28. The homemade Christmas ornament. December in a Depression-era household, the season called for celebration. The catalog showed glass ornaments. The money wasn't there. Tin foil saved from gum wrappers all year was shaped into stars. Paper folded into chains. Popcorn strung with a needle and thread. Dried apple slices hung from branches. Flowers, salt, and water mixed into dough, shaped, baked, and painted. These ornaments were not aspirational. They were made because there was nothing else. But the trees they decorated were loved with a specificity that a tree full of store-bought objects rarely matches. Every piece had a maker. Every piece was a record of a particular December in a particular household. The children who decorated those trees grew up to buy glass ornaments, but many kept one or two of the homemade ones because they knew something that can't be purchased. 29. The homemade dishcloth. Knitted from cotton yarn, crocheted from strips of worn fabric, cut and hemmed from a piece of flour sack laundered soft. When too worn for dishes, it moved to the sink, then the floor, then the porch. Nothing moved from alive to dead in one step. The hidden economy of the household, usefulness stored in drawers and baskets rather than money in an account. The disposable paper towel made this unnecessary. Grandma's dishcloth lasted years, and when it finally ran out of lives, it didn't go in the trash until it cleaned everything in the house at least twice. 30. The homemade lunch wrap. Wax paper, a cloth napkin, a tin lunch pail, a syrup bucket tight enough to keep a sandwich from drying out on a 3-mile walk to school. Use what works, bring it home, clean it, use it again. Mill workers, coal miners, farm hands, children in one-room schoolhouses. The packed lunch was the single most universally practiced form of household economy in American history. The single-use plastic bag replaced it in a generation. 31. The homemade cold remedy. Lemon and honey in a jar, elderberry syrup put up in September, a tin of mustard powder for a chest plaster. Before NyQuil in 1966, before the cold and flu aisle, illness was managed at home with what had been found to help. The mustard plaster was in common use into the 1940s. The warmth increased circulation, the mild irritant drew heat to the surface, steam softened congestion. It worked well enough that people kept doing it for generations. The modern cold remedy is better in almost every measurable way, but the homemade version had one quality the modern lacks. The person administering it knew exactly what was in it and why. 32. The vinegar bottle. Before the cabinet under the sink filled up with 10 specialized bottles, there was a jug of vinegar. It cut grease, dissolved mineral deposits, addressed odors in old wooden ice boxes and old cloth. The contrast isn't about effectiveness. White vinegar actually works reasonably well against a wide range of household cleaning tasks. The contrast is about knowledge. A woman who cleaned with vinegar knew what it was, knew what it did, understood the principle by which it worked. Today, most bottles under the sink list ingredients in chemical names that require a chemistry degree to parse. Grandma knew what she was cleaning. She just called it vinegar. 33. The pantry label and recipe card. Pencil label on a jar lid, a date, what was inside, sometimes a note, sweeter than last year. A recipe card in whatever hand she wrote in, accumulated over years in a box or drawer. The pantry label prevented the loss of a carefully put-up jar because no one could remember if the pale orange stuff was peach preserves or carrot marmalade. The recipe card prevented the loss of a dish that existed nowhere but in the hands of the person who made it. Most of those cards are gone now. The dishes that lived only on them are gone with them. The knowledge that didn't get written down or got thrown away with the estate. A pencil label on a jar was a small act of respect for future effort. Someone will be here after me, opening this. They deserve to know what they're opening. 34. The homemade fire starter. Dry paper twists, corn cobs split and dried, wood shavings gathered from the workshop, short lengths of fat wood that caught on a single match. The lesson of the fire starter is entirely about timing. Gathered in October for January, brought inside before the storm, waiting where it would be needed. A cold house at 6 in the morning when the fire won't catch cannot be easily solved in the moment. It can be prevented entirely by the person who thought about it in the fall. Grandma didn't call it strategy, she called it common sense. 35. The clothespin bag. Made from a scrap of fabric, hung on the line itself, moving with you as you worked, always within reach, never requiring you to set down a wet sheet and walk back. Such a small object, but it tells the complete story of how older household objects were made. A small inefficiency in a repetitive task was noticed. A solution was sewn from scrap fabric in an hour. No trip to the store, no product category. Just a woman who paid attention and fixed what she noticed. This is what domestic ingenuity looked like for most of human history.
Not dramatic innovation, but small, accurate solutions built from available materials over a lifetime of paying attention. 37. The homemade tooth powder. Before the squeeze tube, most Americans cleaned their teeth with powder. Baking soda, mildly abrasive, alkaline enough to neutralize decay-causing acids, cheap enough to be in essentially every household. Sometimes salt for antiseptic effect, sometimes dried sage, used as a tooth cleaner for centuries, sometimes dried mint. Colgate introduced commercial paste in a collapsible tube in 1896, but mass adoption across all income levels took decades. The baking soda routine persisted in households that saw no reason to change something that worked. Dentists today still recommend baking soda for cleaning and whitening. Grandma didn't call it innovation, she called it Tuesday morning. 38. The patchwork potholder. Thick, close-stitched, quilt scraps and old denim layered deep enough to actually protect a hand from a cast-iron pan. Hung from a nail near the stove, darkened by steam and smoke and years of kitchen work. This was the potholder before the potholder was something you bought. It worked because the person who made it understood what it needed to do. Not look new, but hold heat long enough to set the pan down.
39. The rag mop. Best cloth touched skin and dishes. Worn cloth touched floors. Roughest cloth touched the places nothing else would. Nothing fell from useful to useless in one jump. Objects descended through usefulness the way water descends, always finding the next level, never stopping until they reached the absolute bottom. 40. The homemade scrub brush substitute. A corn husk, a piece of rough burlap, the worn end of a broom. Older households knew the material they were cleaning before they chose what to clean it with. Cast iron tolerated a lot, enamel less, soft wood less than that. That judgment is easy to lose when every task comes with its own disposable pad. And then there was the 41st essential, the one that held all the others together. It wasn't a physical object. You couldn't put it in a basket or hang it on a hook. It was a way of paying attention. Some households wrote things down, a note near the flour bin, a date on a jar lid, a list of what needed doing before winter. Many households simply remembered which porch step complained under weight, which stove handle had started to loosen, where the draft came in on a north wind, which hinge warned before it failed. A practical household kept watch, not as a special occasion, as the background condition of living in a space you understood and meant to keep. A squeak, a draft, a crack, a wobble, a leak. Each one spoke before failure arrived. Each one was a small advance notice. Fix this cheaply now or expensively later. Today, most objects in most American homes are designed to be replaced rather than understood. They fail without warning because they were never designed to warn. The infrastructure for repair, the knowledge, the skill, the shops that could do the work has been dismantled over 50 years of cheap manufacturing and planned obsolescence. But a house still rewards attention. A hinge still warns before it fails. A blade still dulls before it breaks. A towel still thins at the edge before it tears. The deeper pattern behind everything on this list is not that the past was better or easier. It wasn't. Laundry was backbreaking. Stoves demanded constant tending. Winter was genuinely dangerous for families without enough heat. Nostalgia should never sand the rough edges off real life. But older households carried something that convenience has quietly weakened: the habit of looking closely before discarding, the knowledge that usefulness has layers, that a shirt becomes an apron becomes a rag becomes a mop, that a jar can become storage, a sack can become cloth, a scrap can become warmth. They knew the path from shirt to apron to rag to mop. They knew a grease can helped win a war. They knew a seed envelope was next year's garden. They didn't call it wisdom. They called it taking care of what you had. And in most American households before plastic took over, the answer to the question,
is there still life left in this, was almost always yes.